The high-stakes theater of international diplomacy, some of the most consequential battles are fought not with words at summit tables, but through calculated moves made in boardrooms thousands of miles away. While cameras focused on the tense exchanges between American and Chinese leaders during the APEC summit in South Korea, a different kind of power play was unfolding, one that would reshape the architecture of global commerce for decades to come. As President Trump arrived with a familiar arsenal of tariff threats and economic ultimatums, Beijing had already decided it wouldn't sit idle, waiting to react to Washington's next move. Instead, China deployed a dual strategy so sophisticated that most observers initially missed its full implications. On one hand, it tightened its grip on the materials that make modern civilization possible. On the other, it opened its arms wider to its Asian neighbors, weaving a trade network so comprehensive it could fundamentally alter the balance of economic power on Earth. This wasn't a defensive maneuver. It was the unveiling of a long-term blueprint for dominance, one built not on confrontation, but on the quiet, irreversible logic of supply chains and strategic partnerships. While Washington brandished the blunt instrument of tariffs, Beijing was already writing the rules for a new economic order, one where influence doesn't flow through military might or diplomatic pressure, but through the invisible threads that connect factories, technologies, and markets across continents. The story of how China achieved this begins not with politics, but with chemistry, specifically with 17 obscure elements that most people have never heard of, yet without which our modern world would simply cease to function. Deep inside every smartphone you've ever held, every electric vehicle humming silently down the street, every wind turbine spinning on distant hillsides, and every precision-guided weapon in modern arsenals, there exists a group of metals so critical to contemporary life that their absence would send civilization backward by decades. These are the rare earth elements, a collection of 17 chemical compounds with names that sound like they belong in science fiction: neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, yttrium, lanthanum. They don't capture headlines. They're not traded on consumer markets. Most people couldn't identify them on the periodic table. Yet these materials represent the invisible architecture of the 21st century. A smartphone contains tiny amounts of at least 6 different rare earths. The powerful magnets that drive electric motors rely on neodymium and dysprosium. The screens we stare at for hours each day glow thanks to europium and terbium. Advanced missile guidance systems, satellite communications, medical imaging devices all depend on these obscure elements performing functions that nothing else can replicate. And here's the uncomfortable truth that keeps defense analysts and corporate executives awake at night. China doesn't just dominate the rare earth market, it effectively owns it. Through decades of strategic investment, aggressive industrial policy, and a willingness to absorb the environmental costs that other nations refuse to bear, China has constructed an empire of extraction and refinement that produces approximately 70% of the world's mined rare earths. But that's just the beginning of the story. Mining is only the first step. The real power lies in refinement, the complex, polluting, technically demanding process of transforming raw ore into usable materials. Here, China's dominance becomes almost total. Roughly 90% of all rare earth processing happens within Chinese borders. Even rare earths mined in other countries often get shipped to China for refinement because nowhere else has developed the technical capacity and industrial scale to do it cost-effectively. This supremacy didn't emerge accidentally. While Western nations treated rare earths as just another commodity to be bought on global markets, China recognized them as strategic assets and built an entire ecosystem around them. From the mining operations in Inner Mongolia to the separation facilities in Jiangxi province, from the magnet manufacturing plants in Ningbo to the recycling operations recovering rare earths from discarded electronics, China constructed an integrated value chain that no other nation can currently match. Today, Chinese companies don't just sell raw materials, They manufacture the finished magnets that power electric vehicle motors worldwide, create the components for offshore wind farms, and supply the specialized materials that enable cutting-edge defense technologies. When you buy a Tesla, a Siemens wind turbine, or examine the supply chain behind an F-35 fighter jet, you're inevitably tracing lines back to Chinese rare earth production. This is strategic power in its most concentrated form. Control not over armies or currencies, but over the fundamental materials that enable technological civilization. And in early October 2025, Beijing decided it was time to remind the world exactly who held this power. The rules change overnight. On October 9, 2025, as diplomatic preparations intensified for the upcoming Trump-Xi meeting, China's Ministry of Commerce published a document that would send tremors through global supply chains. Announcement number 61 appeared bureaucratic and technical on its surface, the kind of regulatory update that normally generates little attention outside specialized trade law circles. But those who understood its implications immediately recognized it as something far more significant. A fundamental reshaping of how rare earth materials would flow through the global economy. The new regulations established a comprehensive licensing system covering rare earth materials, processing technologies, and even the manufacturing equipment used to work with these elements. Every company outside China seeking to purchase rare earths would now need explicit approval from Chinese authorities. Every transaction would be scrutinized. Every end use would be evaluated, and crucially, licenses could be denied, no explanation required, if Beijing determined the materials might serve purposes it deemed contrary to Chinese national interests. The categories targeted for heightened scrutiny revealed the strategic thinking behind the policy. Defense applications topped the list, naturally. But the rules also covered advanced semiconductor manufacturing, aerospace technologies, and the broad category of dual-use technologies that could serve both civilian and military purposes. In practice, this definition could stretch to encompass almost any advanced industrial application. But the most striking element, the provision that truly marked this as a geopolitical weapon rather than mere administrative reform, was what trade lawyers quickly recognized as an extraterritorial enforcement mechanism modeled directly on the foreign direct product rule that the United States had wielded against Chinese technology companies in recent years. America had used this rule to prevent chips made anywhere in the world with American equipment from reaching Chinese firms like Huawei. Now China was inverting the weapon. Under this new framework, Chinese authority would extend far beyond China's borders. Any product manufactured anywhere in the world that incorporated Chinese rare earth materials or was produced using Chinese processing technology could potentially require Beijing's approval before being exported again. A magnet factory in Germany purchasing Chinese neodymium under Chinese jurisdiction. A Japanese manufacturer building electric motors with Chinese refined dysprosium, potentially subject to Chinese export controls. A Dutch company making advanced equipment using components that somewhere in their supply chain contain trace amounts of Chinese rare earth processing. Beijing might have a say in where that equipment could go. To close any remaining loopholes, Chinese regulators added a provision set to take effect on December 1st that stunned supply chain analysts with its comprehensiveness. The new rules would include a de minimis threshold of just 0.1%. This meant that even if a product contained only trace amounts of Chinese origin rare earth materials, less than 0.1% of its total composition, it could still trigger the licensing requirement. Consider the implications. A sophisticated electronic component might pass through 5 different countries during its production, with dozens of companies contributing to its final form. If anywhere in that complex chain, even the tiniest amount of Chinese rare earth processing was involved, the final product could fall under Beijing's regulatory reach. It was a rule designed to make independence from Chinese rare earths functionally impossible for most advanced manufacturers. Chinese officials framed the announcement in measured procedural language. This was about national security, they explained, not retaliation or economic warfare. These regulations simply aligned China with international practices, protecting sensitive materials from potential misuse. The tone was calm, bureaucratic, almost boring in its technicality. But the timing told a different story. These rules were published just days before President Trump and President Xi were scheduled to meet face-to-face at the APEC summit, a gathering already overshadowed by escalating trade tensions and American threats of new tariffs. The message was unmistakable. While tariffs make for dramatic headlines and tough-sounding political rhetoric, real power in the modern economy flows from control over the materials that make everything else possible. And that power, Beijing was now demonstrating, resided firmly in Chinese hands. The announcement represented something more profound than a trade policy adjustment. It was a declaration that in the contest for 21st century economic supremacy, China would no longer simply react to Western initiatives. It would set terms, define boundaries, and exercise the kind of structural leverage that comes from controlling resources that others cannot easily replace. As global markets absorbed the news, another dimension of China's strategy was already taking shape, one that would show the world that Beijing's approach to power wasn't just about restriction and control, but about building something new. When supply chains become weapons. The shockwaves from China's announcement rippled outward with startling speed, revealing just how deeply the world had become dependent on Chinese rare earth production. Within 72 hours, prices for rare earth magnets began climbing. Within a week, procurement officers at major manufacturing firms across 3 continents were frantically reviewing their supply contracts, trying to calculate exposure and identify vulnerabilities. In the Pentagon, defense officials convened urgent meetings to assess a reality they'd long been warned about but had never fully addressed. Every major weapons system in the American arsenal relied on Chinese rare earth materials. The F-35 Lightning II fighter jet, the most expensive weapons program in human history, requires approximately 920 pounds of rare earth materials per aircraft. Virginia-class submarines need even more. Precision-guided missiles, advanced radar systems, electronic warfare equipment, satellite communications, all depend on magnets and components that trace back to Chinese supply chains. Even a modest disruption in rare earth flows could delay production schedules by months and drive costs dramatically higher. A complete cutoff, while unlikely, would represent a national security crisis of the first order. The Defense Department had spent years talking about diversifying rare earth sources, had funded pilot programs and research initiatives, but when the moment arrived, the stark truth remained. There was no readily available alternative to Chinese supply. The technology sector faced similar revelations. The electric vehicle revolution, touted as the future of transportation and a cornerstone of climate policy, runs almost entirely on Chinese rare earth magnets. Every major automaker, from Tesla to Volkswagen to Toyota, depends on motors powered by neodymium iron boron magnets that Chinese companies dominate. The wind energy sector discovered it was equally exposed. The massive direct drive turbines that will supposedly power a renewable future require enormous permanent magnets that, again, Chinese firms control. But what truly magnified the impact was that foreign direct product rule analog embedded in China's new regulations. This wasn't just about companies directly purchasing Chinese materials. It potentially reached products manufactured entirely outside China if they incorporated, at any stage of production, technology or materials that came from Chinese rare earth processing. A German company making precision motors suddenly realized that even though they assembled components domestically, their supply chain included magnets processed in China. A South Korean manufacturer of advanced sensors discovered that testing equipment they relied on contained Chinese rare earth elements. A Dutch firm producing semiconductor manufacturing equipment found that specialized components, several layers deep in their supply chain, traced back to Chinese refinement processes. Overnight, the architecture of global manufacturing revealed itself as far more vulnerable than corporate executives had acknowledged. For decades, Western firms had pursued efficiency above all else, outsourcing not just labor-intensive work, but also technically complex and environmentally problematic processes like rare earth refining. They'd treated supply chains as purely economic calculations, optimizing for cost and speed while ignoring geopolitical risk. Now those decisions presented themselves not as clever cost-cutting measures, but as strategic vulnerabilities. Analysts at prominent research firms began publishing assessments that made for uncomfortable reading. Nomura estimated that even a modest slowdown in licensing approvals could affect production across industries collectively worth more than $1.2 trillion annually. ING warned that European manufacturing could face cascading delays as the December 1st implementation date approached. The consensus became clear. China hadn't just threatened to disrupt supply chains, it had demonstrated that it already possessed the power to do so, and had simply chosen, for now, not to exercise that power fully. Japan, which imports nearly 60% of its rare earth materials from China, moved with particular urgency. Trade officials fast-tracked negotiations with Australia and Vietnam, trying to secure alternative sources. But the hard reality became apparent quickly. There are few alternatives, and those that exist cannot scale fast enough to matter. Building new mines takes years. Developing refining capacity requires not just capital, but technical expertise that remains concentrated in China. Even if every proposed alternative project succeeded, it would be the better part of a decade before they could collectively provide even a fraction of what China currently supplies. The European Union, recognizing the threat to its Green Deal ambitions and automotive sector, established an emergency task force to study rare earth security. But studying a problem and solving it are different things. The task force's preliminary findings only confirmed what industry already knew. Europe had allowed itself to become almost completely dependent on Chinese rare earth supply chains, and reversing that dependence would require investments measured in the tens of billions of euros and time measured in decades. In Washington, politicians called China's move economic coercion and weaponization of trade dependencies. There were calls for retaliation, for matching restrictions, for mobilizing Western alternatives. But markets saw something more subtle and more concerning. Beijing wasn't actually blocking exports. It was managing them. It was asserting the right to decide who received what, and when, and under what conditions. That measured exercise of control sent a more powerful message than any outright ban would have, because it demonstrated not panic or anger, but confidence and patience. This was structural power made visible, the kind of leverage that doesn't need to be exercised dramatically to be effective. The mere existence of these regulations, the knowledge that every shipment now required approval, that licenses could be delayed or denied, created a psychological effect that rippled through every boardroom making decisions about future investments. Companies began stockpiling materials, hoarding supplies against future uncertainty, which only drove prices higher and made the problem more acute. The irony wasn't lost on careful observers. For 3 decades, Western corporations and governments had pursued a policy of allowing China to handle the dirtiest, most complex, and least profitable parts of industrial production. It had seemed like a win-win arrangement. China accepted the environmental costs and technical challenges. Western firms got cheap materials. Now that strategic choice, repeated across dozens of industries, had transformed into strategic vulnerability. Every attempt to diversify revealed just how deeply embedded Chinese dominance had become. And while defense contractors scrambled, automakers reconsidered production plans, and government task forces wrote reports, Beijing was already moving to the next phase of its strategy, one that would demonstrate that China's approach to global power involved not just leverage over adversaries, but the construction of alternative frameworks for cooperation. Building the new Asia. While Washington doubled down on the language of confrontation, imposing tariffs, restricting technology exports, and organizing security pacts to contain Chinese influence. Beijing was quietly constructing something that might prove far more consequential. An integrated Asian economy so deeply interconnected that separating from it would be economically unthinkable for participating nations. On October 28, 2025, in Kuala Lumpur, this vision took tangible form. Chinese Premier Li Qiang stood alongside the leaders of 10 Southeast Asian nations to sign what was being called the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement 3.0. The ceremony itself was understated. No dramatic announcements, no provocative language, just the signing of a comprehensive trade pact that, upon closer examination, represented one of the most significant realignments of economic power in modern history. The numbers alone told an extraordinary story. The agreement linked China with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, collectively representing more than 2.1 billion people, and a combined gross domestic product approaching $23 trillion. For perspective, that's larger than the entire European Union and approaching the economic scale of the United States itself. In a single agreement, nearly a third of humanity had been brought into an integrated trade framework with dramatically reduced barriers and aligned regulatory standards. But the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement 3.0 was never just about eliminating tariffs. Previous versions of the agreement, dating back to the original Pact in 2010, had already reduced most traditional trade barriers. This new iteration was qualitatively different. It represented the construction of shared infrastructure for an integrated economic zone spanning from Yunnan province to the Indonesian archipelago. The upgraded agreement added 9 entirely new chapters focused on 21st century economic integration. There were provisions for digital economy cooperation, creating aligned standards for e-commerce, cross-border data flows, and digital payment systems. There were frameworks for green transition technologies, coordinating investments in renewable energy, electric vehicles, and sustainable manufacturing. There were commitments to infrastructure connectivity, linking Chinese Belt and Road projects with ASEAN's own development plans. There were agreements on regulatory harmonization, ensuring that product standards would align across the region, making supply chains more efficient and reducing compliance costs. The timeline was both ambitious and concrete. Over the next decade, 92% of all goods traded between China and ASEAN nations would move at zero tariffs. New frameworks for digital and environmental cooperation would begin implementation by 2027. Investment restrictions would be progressively eliminated, allowing Chinese capital to flow more freely into Southeast Asia and ASEAN exports to access China's massive consumer market with fewer obstacles. These weren't vague aspirations. Negotiations for this version of the agreement had begun quietly in late 2022 and concluded in May 2025, representing thousands of hours of technical work, careful compromise, and detailed planning. The agreement ran to hundreds of pages of specific commitments, timelines, and mechanisms for dispute resolution and implementation review. To understand the significance, consider the trajectory. In 2010, when the original China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement took effect, bilateral trade stood at approximately $292 billion. Already substantial, but still modest compared to China's trade with Europe or the United States. By 2024, that figure had exploded to $982 billion, making China and ASEAN each other's largest trading partners. The upgraded agreement was designed to push that figure past $1.5 trillion within 5 years. For Chinese leaders, the strategic logic was multi-layered. Most obviously, the agreement secured China's position as the anchor of Asian trade at precisely the moment when Western markets were becoming more hostile and unpredictable. It created deep economic interdependencies that would make it costly for ASEAN nations to join any American-led efforts to economically isolate China. It provided new markets for Chinese exports as American and European consumers turned to protectionism. but the deeper logic was about supply chains and production networks. As Western companies struggled with whether and how to de-risk their China exposure, Chinese firms were using the upgraded ASEAN agreement to distribute production across the region while maintaining Chinese ownership and control. Electric vehicle manufacturers were establishing plants in Thailand and Indonesia. Battery firms were building factories in Vietnam and Malaysia. Electronics companies were expanding operations in the Philippines and Myanmar. This wasn't China losing manufacturing capacity. It was China building an extended manufacturing ecosystem that would be counted as ASEAN exports when products shipped to Western markets, thus avoiding tariffs and political opposition, while the profits, intellectual property, and strategic control remained with Chinese firms. It was economic statecraft at its most sophisticated. For ASEAN countries, the deal offered something Washington could no longer credibly promise: economic integration with the world's second-largest economy and fastest-growing major market. China wasn't just a trading partner, it was becoming the primary source of infrastructure investment, technology transfer, and capital flows. Chinese tourists represented the largest group of international visitors for most Southeast Asian nations. Chinese students studied at regional universities in growing numbers.